ticket office also has an interactive computer, Apple computer discourse on the site, which is very good. This is apparently remains, a stretch of the remains of the Roman road between Lisbon and Bacara Augusta, or Braga, a small city north of Porto, I believe, formed by large limestone blocks, 13.12 feet wide, 4 meters, as apparently is standard for Roman roads. And it was sided by porticos under roof, if you will. In other words, sidewalks under the porticos, along in that area there probably, on both sides. It's amazing. At least as it went through the city, and there were shops on either side of that. And apparently, if we look closely, we can see the wheel ruts, and that may be something like that one right there, and there's a double something there, and down there you can see a couple more, just from where wagons and so forth would ride down through there. And this was probably typical of 305 to 306 AD. These are mosaics found in 1899 during the preliminary excavations. This one on the left was recovered from the dining room of the house of Cantabert, and the one on the right is of unknown provenance, a rich polychrominate decoration depicting mostly geometric subjects. So we'll just take a close look. We've got much more to look at. But remember, these were like our expensive carpets in an expensive home, with designs, or even more appropriately, I think, Persian. But look at the intricacy of that, particularly with the color. And imagine if somehow that color might have been more vibrant, either with some kind of surface material or polishing or whatever. And notice the small stones, the detail, the time it took to create it. Very much perhaps analogous to creating Persian rugs or some of the other rugs I've seen fabrics created like in Japan last year. Now we'll go to the right to the House of Fountains. Of course, as we walk through this area, there are all kinds of walls, because this was a town of considerable size. And so what remains even visible is much more than what we'll actually see as defined. For example, this House of Fountains. Now, this House of Fountains, as you can see, is pretty substantial. Even in American terms, Jackson Hole terms, it's a sizable home. And it was 2 stories. One story providing one facade, and the other story providing a still different facade. And then the main entrance to this, I believe, this part of the house, or this house, was ripped apart off when they put in that, what we see ahead of us is a defensive wall, which is what the main story is behind this, other than the city foundation itself. What we've been looking at. And just to recap from this interpretive sign, aristocratic residence built over a previous construction which was partially reused. That may account for those lower rooms and that excavated stairway. It represents the best example of mosaic art, mural painting, and waterworks architecture known in this city. Its period is the beginning of the 1st century AD, but had changes all the way through the first half of the 2nd century, being demolished and abandoned by the end of the 3rd century, at the beginning of the 4th, due to the construction of the late imperial wall. And as the guidebook says, what you'll see today here is probably the finest that you'll see in Europe, except for what you might see in Rome. Here is I think it's called the peristyle, and that is a series or a matrix of columns. And here there's 6 by 8 columns, if you count the corner ones twice for that calculation. What's fascinating to look at something like this, which is residential, is to reflect on your own house, particularly a house like Dave and Judy's that they've actually built. And imagine if 2,000 years from now, somebody could actually look at the remains of it. Of course, they're made out of wood, so that's doubtful. And this site, befitting its status and of importance, is well developed for viewing, I think. So we'll go here to the left. So this drawing gives a little hint of what it would have looked like looking at the exterior of the peristyle or center of the home. Notice the size. This is pretty substantial. Of course, when you start off with walls that are 1.5 feet thick, it's kind of bound to give it dimension. I'm not going to try and do a great deal of content because I've got the €2 brochure, and if I want to in the future I can come back in. So what I'm mainly doing is recording for later study, if you will. Here we don't see too much in the way of vibrancy of color, and that may be due to 2,000 years or something else. Mostly geometric design, floral in this instance, so it's a little bit more than geometric, but here along the sides geometric for sure. And then the center, it's hard to figure out what that is, if anything. I don't think it's a picture, I just think it's a specific graphic. This first panel, on the other hand, looks as though, unless those are just fill-in stones to fill it in, look like it was trying to have some kind of a design element, but I can't see that. It may just be a complete repetition, although perhaps with different colors, the same graphic. On a closer inspection, it looks like right there, for example, that there are animals in the center of those graphics. Let me turn the camera sideways so you can see it that way. There we are. So those look like horses or some kind of four-footed animal. See, look at that animal on the right. It looks like it either has a couple spears out of the back of its neck or a strange location for long antlers. Could the figure on the left actually be a lion in pursuit of that animal? So again, to keep myself oriented, I'm going to pan from one place to another, something I wouldn't necessarily normally do. And we'll look at this mosaic. Now this one's different not only in layout, but somewhat in layout, but in content. Here you have a line of graphics that looks somewhat floral, like if it were a leaf. And then these, which are purely geometric, it looks like this broader band. And then we get into the square section. Notice the corner is actually a face. Was this a member of the family? Was it a person of importance in the culture at that time that they wanted to pander to or show some reverence for? And down here, I'm turning the camera now so we can get an orientation we don't get from the stand. Are these depicting, for example, common day scenes? That would be a normal thing. Or perhaps it's some men, maybe the owner of the home, hunting with his dogs. Walking down this walkway here to the main axis of this walkway so I can get a better view of that panel we're looking at. Okay, here we have a much better view. Let's start with looking at the companion border shot. And again, looks like a man with a dog on a tether or a leash, and maybe some bigger animal that's being tracked or pushed. And then who are these characters right here? Is that a woman? You can't tell if they wore togas like men. Maybe they tied them off like that also. Of course, it's quite possible that everything I'm looking at has a very definite story. I'm just ignorant of it. Here certainly looks like a man on a chariot with a brace of 4 horses. Now I'm going to go back a little ways here to where we started, just so we can look at the mosaics that are on the other side of this main aisle that I showed you, this raised aisle. This, a small room, and apparently just pragmatically floored with simple geometric design. Maybe it was a kitchen or some practical type of room. Here the layout is different. It's 9 squares, or excuse me, in which the outer ones are all square, appear to be all geometric, appear to have all designs that are geometric. Only in the center is there a differentiation in the sense of the circular format, and it looks like there's some kind of a design, and we're seeing it from the wrong perspective, because those look like the feet of an animal. We're looking at it from upside down, I believe. At some point we'll visit the house of the swastika. Now, swastika was not the evil signal or icon that it has taken on since Hitler. It was more of a religious, more of a spiritual power type of icon, I believe. But it's quite possible that many of the graphics that we see here were in fact, or did in fact, have significant iconographic value. So here we're about to make a right, but we're not going to. We're going to pause at the corner here, and again look at this center peristyle section, which looks like it has waterways and gardens in the center, which would make some kind of sense as the interior of a home. This is typical. I mean, the interior being a critical part. This is typical of homes all over the world. It's only in places, I think, like the United States, where we consider the house to be sacrosanct and put all of our gardens out around it in our yard in order to display the house. Okay, so here we're looking at the walkway around the peristyle center section. Again, mostly graphics. Is this border graphic here some kind of a multiple swastika representation? I don't know. Artists may know that inherently. And again, it looks like there are large squares that have a rounded motif and some kind of graphic in the center. I can't be sure what that is just looking at my camera. Again, something down here at this end, which I can't make out from here, but probably there's a good picture of it in the brochure. Okay, now I'm looking down the long axis, the 8-column side of the peristyle. Again, that's the same borderline format, but we can't see it closely from this perspective yet. But notice here alongside that the house did have a subterranean section. For what purpose, I don't know. We're standing outside, it looks like outside the building, and it may be the case at this small mosaic here of a man holding a rabbit, it looks like, in one hand, or actually it looks like a platypus, but I doubt it's that. And then he may be carrying a bucket or a jar full of some kind of product. But notice as we look down into this excavation of a stairway that we see a different level there. And notice over there an archway that's been covered in part by that wall, showing that there was some previous use of that. Again, this was built and used and modified over the course of more than 1 century and less than 2. Here we look down into something, but notice the grooves along the side, probably for the placement of a stone. Maybe that was some kind of a bath that had been created, particularly if that was an intentional drainage area around there. And I'm just guessing, it's pure guesswork on my part. And was this a subterranean third basement floor, if you will? Or was it considered to be the first of those 2 floors? And notice that these walls also function to some degree as buttresses. Of course, we notice that the brick composes these columns. And then the columns would have been covered with a cement stucco for classic realism. But you can imagine this must have been a very pretty little center garden, particularly if there were some way to have fountains in it. We're at the far corner, and we can see quite closely this design, and of course it has a fish motif. You wonder what the significance of the different design graphics, symbol graphics were. Was there a reason why this whole section is this way? And are these waves? Is those supposed to be depictions of ways? I don't know. Here you can see that there were structures and rooms underneath what we're seeing as floors right now, which is kind of interesting. How deeply in did they go? What was their purpose? This looks 2 levels. Were they storage? Were they lived in? They're very simple mosaic. Again, for this small room, I want to pan on this wall that cuts right straight through the village, or through that Roman town, because it is of great significance here. Of course, it's destroyed whatever portion of this residence was once in the space it occupies. Okay, here we have the opposite perspective that we had when we first entered. These little protrusions that I see here seem to suggest that there would have been other things installed on this. Maybe that was just for holding the brickwork that we see there. Just for fun, I'm going to pan slowly across this just so we can see. Did the artist pre-design these? Did he scribble out a couple of patterns to try? Did he test them on the owner to see if the owner liked them? Was there some logic in there? You can see a difference in that kind of maze detail and this maze detail versus these square and more geometric squared details. And again, even a different kind of these matrix, or it's not the word I really want. And notice this one that singularly has the outline of a bull, it looks like, in the center. This, I would imagine, is allegorical. It seems to have a, well, I was going to say warrior man, but it looks like he's standing on a surfboard. He's got a weapon in his left hand. He's got some kind of a headdress, I think. It looks like he's holding a skull, or a severed head. Yes, he is. And he's holding it for the perusal of a dragon-like fishy thing. Okay, in the middle of the 5th century AD, i.e. around 450 in that area, that time frame, the Romans had pulled out as they retrenched in the fall of their empire. And so northern tribes invaded down into Spain and Portugal. And around 465, those tribes went on a strong offensive, and before that, at that point in time, these people, sensing the threat, ripped out everything in the way of putting in this wall and built hastily this defensive wall. Hastily in the sense that probably it's built of rock, stones that were worked, probably cannibalized from houses like this one that were ripped up in order to build the wall, and then filled in with loose rubble for bulk, if you will. Then, ironically, a Christian Germanic tribe did conquer this city and built a basilica, which we are apparently going to see at the end of this wall. What we've been looking at. And just to recap from this interpretive sign, aristocratic residence built over a previous construction which was partially reused. That may account for those lower rooms and that excavated stairway. It represents the best example of mosaic art, mural painting, and waterworks architecture known in this city. Its period is the beginning of the 1st century AD, but had changes all the way through the first half of the 2nd century, being demolished and abandoned by the end of the 3rd century, at the beginning of the 4th, due to the construction of the late imperial wall. So the interpretive sign there points out that this wall was built at the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th century AD. It has military significance because of some of the design elements which were typical of the Roman era. And we now are standing on this old Roman road. And again, you may notice that little grooving there, or the one there, if in fact those are grooved. But this looks like it had several gates, plus a portcullis, which would be a metal grate that could be raised up and down, and it slid in slots, which we may or may not see. There we are, right here. This is typical of gates in general of this magnitude. You see it, of course, in the Roman works, and I'm sure it was picked up by other people who built such edifices. This big rock here, one wonders how it controlled traffic, and are those grooves there, or the remnant of it, and there of wheels? I don't know. But it's interesting as we look at the remains of these walls, or this wall, to see some of the architectural detritus of the Roman city that was just thrown in here. Or here some columns, quite pretty columns, because they're not round but elongated, but here a portion of the column still embedded when they built the wall right around it. This was hastily built. Looking here inside the gate area, you can see the pivot holes, and this looks like iron. This may have been a later device, but the pivot holes of the gates, so they would have swung on that point and then back in against the wall in these spaces here. Is another arch which seems rather simple and not very structurally. This is interesting because it gives pretty good insight into the channels for which the water and or the steam were allowed to travel underneath the floor. And there you can see, poking back inside there, the stacks of bricks that we saw earlier supporting such a floor. And this may be, this is excellent. This may show us how that steam was actually able to get close to the surface of the floor to create a steam bath environment. Well, additional side points. This apparently was built in a residential area, an expensive residential area, so that it reflected artistic considerations, aesthetic considerations, as well as the pragmatic, allowed for simultaneous use by men and women, but was abandoned after it was essentially ripped apart by the creation of the wall that we've seen. And apparently a geological event occurred that shook the foundations of walls, and those cracks there may suggest that. There we see those little piles indicating. But this is the best example I've ever seen of the design of the baths directly underneath the floor. You still have to wonder how hot would it be, since it had to travel through all of this rock. But then if they keep it cranked up all the time, 24/7, it might not be as hard as it seems. Notice the differences between these walls for some reason. Okay, now I've just come down the wall from where we were earlier, looking at the House of Fountains, looking at what is obviously the remains of another entryway. You can see where the arch started up there. Not much is left here, though, of course. And then the wall continues down. And then also it appears that there was a centerpiece on this wall, a chunk running off at an angle. It's curious, they say that the wall did not completely encompass the town. So you wonder, how could it serve a function if it didn't completely encircle the building of the viaduct? apparently it allowed water to transfer underneath the Roman road somehow. Although it's not clear to me how it did what it supposedly did. Here is the drawing, and again I'm unable to see how it did what they're suggesting. Getting off to the side here in the weeds, I can see what looks like, without going deeper into the weeds, an arch which may represent a waterway passing, so that the river passed through there somehow, or the aqueduct passed through there. There you can see a little hint of an arch dead center there, that red thing poking out suggests up through another part of this wall. I don't know if this was the Roman road or not. It certainly is not utilizing the massive rocks that are used, or stones. These are the baths of the aqueduct. I'm guessing this is the aqueduct here, and that these are the baths that are being alluded to. Now being used as a little amphitheater, which the Romans would have gotten a real kick out of, having a bath converted to an amphitheater. But apparently those rounded areas there are part of what the baths would have been. I've seen them before. Notice the holes that we can see. There would have carried water or steam into those areas. You have to see a better layout of this to envision it more correctly. So this archway that I commented on earlier was probably not relevant to the wall, just happens to end up being attached to it. And probably because they didn't want to destroy the baths, so they ran the wall just adjacent to that. Standing in front of right now, which is next to the baths, is the Castellum Divisorium. This is its layout, its design. This is what remains, and I'll try to identify it. An artist envisioned it would have looked like. Of course, are the troughs that would have carried water through that little arched vaulted area. It's hard looking at all of this to tell what it is that we are looking at. I can't see where that tank would have been. Get there, but it's a big rectangular tank where the aqueduct of about 2 miles ended, and then from this reservoir plumbing and stone piping distributed the water to the different neighborhood baths and fountains of the first century AD. Interesting as I walk along here and look at the pieces of architectural detail that are just piled or warehoused here until they can think of something else to do with them. That's all that remains. And what a moment it was when the workmen installed that pretty base there for a column, if that's what it was, or when they put up some of those columns. How did they feel about their achievement? How would they feel today? I'm only guessing that those columns and that white looking surface there is all relatively new, but we can still see remnants of column bases there. Imagine what's implied by these structures. Were these tall outer buildings with columns and steps that people would hang out on near the forum? Were these shop bases here? Likely water or sewer trenches, as with over there. The forum was the center of the Roman city. This is the great Flavian forum of Conímbriga, dedicated to the divinization of emperor's cult, whatever that means. This is what it might have looked like. So those columns we see are just a few of what would have ringed at least, well, it appears all 4 sides. And presumably there were columns in here, but they were covered. Now it's all covered. I don't know what the distinction being drawn here is. Perhaps it's a subsequent Augustan structure. The troughs for water covered over, or sewage. Can imagine they would have killed for some PVC. Okay, here we may be getting a little protected look, or look at protected original stonework. Too cool. So what's over here, what's covering this now is probably something to protect. What would have been down in these cavities, if anything? Certainly something was down there. Those are pedestals for something. Look at the size and thickness of these walls. Notice that these are the wedges that the columns were created out of. One, maybe another was formed another quarter and full round. Notice here the walls cemented over or plastered over. Of course they took those brick that they created these bases out of, or the columns that we've seen. As you can see there, that may be a reproduction of what was internal underneath the plaster, and built those things and then plastered. These darker patches of concrete rough are designed to tell us where each of these pedestals, bases, and columns. These are sizable tunnels, if you will. I think they went for water of some sort, sewage or whatever. What we're looking at right here is called Insula of the Phalanx Vase. Constitutes an assemblage of residences and stores and workshops built in a block of pre-Roman origin, back about the middle of the 1st century AD. So the use of this area was terminated as you got closer to the medieval period, after 500 AD, in part because it was so close to the Forum, and in part because the Christian church was here, and in part because it became a cemetery. That would have... Look at the remains and some reconstruction of simulation of the Great Southern Bank. What it would have looked like. Here's the actual layout drawing. Provided baths like I saw in Japan, and this may have been the main big bath here. You can see a little bit of the layering there, which is interesting. But also it was surrounded by open areas that were designed for the purpose of discourse and various sports. So it was what we might think of today, like in Jackson, as our rec center. I'm not sure that's got areas for social discourse. I'm not sure we socially discourse anymore. Here you can see the waterways, if you will, covered over like many waterways in Europe are today, and in South America, with just stones. Here you see stairways going down. For what purpose, I don't know. Maybe an original pipe, water pipe. If so, it looks lead rather than the ceramic or pottery that I saw in East. Whether these were rooms people went down into, or these were rooms where heated water or steam was created. Here a passageway considerably deeper than the grade around it. And notice there almost a bench-like device on the left, and yet stairs going down. This looks like a duplicate of what we saw on the other side, and it could reflect man versus woman. This certainly looks like some kind of a soaking tub with two stairs going down. Look at the thick plastering on the walls. Just that there's rock on the left side and brick on the right. Was the brick considered to be a better insulator? What was this room for? Was it just a reservoir? It's pretty deep for a soaking. Here we can see the drainage trough running down into this deeper trough here, which looks like it at one time was connected to the other side of that little temporary wall. Here, larger water things. So, this would be very much analogous to a system of water pipes underneath a cement slab in a sophisticated house near the bathroom or the kitchen area. Not completely sure what this large area was without taking the time to analyze my brochure, which I'm not going to do yet. Was this for the games? But was there a pool down inside of there? First public baths of Conímbriga were built under Emperor Augustus, period in the 1st century BC, during an ambitious public construction program with the aim of modernizing the city. Fortunately, these remains are underneath the later remains, and so they're difficult apparently to analyze. But had we the time, here's the drawing. Interesting, because here we get an idea of how these little pillars were probably used to support a relatively narrow or shallow space between floors that would allow the heat to travel through to heat up like sauna type things. And here is a round configuration, which we may suggest would have been a pool and maybe a steam room. And again, you can see those rocks piled on to indicate where there was a raised floor. And is this plumbing with the red brick indicative of the new baths that were built over the old? I haven't a clue. It must have been pretty, must have been something. I think what intrigues us is we think of 2,000 years ago as so primitive compared to the way we live. But in retrospect, it's really more analogous than different. Granted, they didn't have electricity, so all of that's not available to them. But when it came to basic mechanics of water, they had their analogous technology. Here, another view of the wall from what is at least an end point at this point in time. Behind me is a rather significant slope leading down into a creek, so presumably the wall ended there. These small wall may simply represent something that existed, that the wall was built around or over or just consumed, with it another way. It's a pretty bush with these pretty orange berries. Notice that some are large, some are small. Maybe there's a different plant that I can't detect in. It's starting to sprinkle, so I'm going to move along here, and I'm running out of battery. What we were just looking at was the House of the Skeletons. This is certainly very pretty. I'll move about so I can get as much of a view of this as I can, but notice how it's divided into two large sections, this one and then this one over here for some reason. And this one, far less fascinating, far less dramatic than the other portion for some reason. More complex design, and notice the three-dimensional achievement. I wonder if that was an optical illusion automatically noticed by the occupants, whereas I just noticed it. much more vibrant color than we've seen before. For what reason, I don't know. But again, totally graphics. No plants or animals. And here's still another very expensive residence with its accompanying mosaics. Look at how this is. Very, very different. Very, very different. Huh. Here, carrying that same idea from the walkway, but in different colors, but with 2, maybe 3 different sections, eh? Now, just to orientate us, I'm going to pan about here, but then I want to go over and get a closer look at these 2 rooms here, particularly that room, which. And this home goes back to the 1st century, a very wealthy family. The mosaics belong to the second half of the 3rd century. Then the house was demolished because of the wall. Imagine the fear that would precipitate the destruction of these beautiful homes. And consider also that this was the 3rd century, so the 200s, so they were still a couple hundred years away from the complete downfall of the Roman Empire. Did they have any hint? Were they like me with the United States? Did they foresee something, but they couldn't tell when it would occur? There was still. Now here, a beautifully preserved but simple mosaic in what looks like an ancillary room. Okay, now I'm looking at that second or middle room. I want to get as much close-up of this as I can. And here's the larger room. Again, what I find fascinating is how they have divided it into sections. Like that one broad section there, which is about 1/3 of the whole room, goes from right to left completely. Then this chunk in the center, but offset obviously because of the first chunk. And then the border 3-sided around it for some reason. Did this reflect how they used the room, how they placed furniture, etc., etc.? Let's look a little more closely at this. These are apparently scales, probably for very valuable things like gold. But look at how dainty this one is. Some of the hardware of the Roman soldiers' gear. That's interesting. Those be buttons on the right there. Oh, boy. And notice the difficulty of pulling them out with those sharp pointies. Those are delicate little hairpins. Looks like Napoleon, doesn't it? I look at a comb like that, I try to imagine the women, the mothers and daughters, grandmothers, who may have successfully used that one. That little paddle in the upper right, probably a mirror. Perhaps a game board. Oh, writing devices. Huh. This grinding wheel is interesting because the top part on the bottom seems concave to match and fit onto the conical portion of the lower piece of stone. So you could drop the grain in, and as it successively ground, it would roll downhill and grind even. Imagine the uses made of these two pots, the tables, and the people around them each time they were used, what the conversations were about, what those vessels held, water, wine. It's interesting because it gives us an idea of the materials used in the construction. Notice that over there with holes would have provided access for steam into a room. Notice what grand colors you would have had with those kind of polished marbles. And there, of course, the sewer pipes or water pipes. These fittings probably locked together adjoining pieces of wood or maybe tools of the stone craftsman, the carver. I've seen people doing this kind of work. I think it was in China. Doing it to repair or restore current architecture. Well, current old. I would have thought glass was a pretty novel material to work with in the past, more so than pottery. I don't know if that's true or not. Here's the metal worker. In all trades, of course, there are those who are the brilliant artists. Here's what that forum might have looked like. How hard it is to look at ruins and translate them into this. How hard it is to take this, but easier, and translate it into how we might have functioned, how we might have walked through it, what we would have felt, what we would have said to friends or people we met on the way. Here a simple mosaic. I don't know if it's the original of one of the ones outside. One of the ones outside did have this character here in it. I don't know if these represent towers. They appear to. Look at the realism of that expression. We try to imagine the face that went with it and the personality. Maybe think of a friend who reminds us of. Here are some scraps of murals that would have decorated the walls, just like wallpaper does, or large paintings or photos do, or wall treatments do. But how elegant to fashion a room in your own home using exactly these designs. I always love these little statues, and I'm guessing, and I imagine when I do and see them, that the person who owned this first and all those who got it afterward loved it, cherished it.